switch things here. Yeah, okay.
The Committee on Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Africa will come to order. You can tell what's on my mind right now. The purpose of this hearing is to examine the fiscal year 2025 State and Foreign Operations Budget request for Africa. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Assistant Secretary Molly Phee, Assistant Administrator Monde Muyangwa, it is my pleasure to welcome you before the Subcommittee on Africa for this hearing examining the President's budget request for Africa. About a year ago, I convened this subcommittee to review the Africa portion of the FY 2024 President's budget request. In that hearing, I raised the issue of dissonance between the national security strategy and the U.S. strategy towards sub-Saharan Africa. Similarly, I find that this fiscal year 2025 request reflects a continued lack of resolve to ensure that necessary resources are in place to strengthen and deepen our partnership on the continent. We are now seeing this lack of resolve reflected in public polling. According to a recent Gallup poll, the United States lost its place as the most influential global power in Africa last year, and its place, other countries, China in particular, gained popularity. Of the 4 global powers included in the poll, the U.S. was the only country not to see its image improve across Africa in 2023. Meanwhile, China's approval in the region rose 6 percentage points, landing 2 points ahead of the U.S. This is not simply a reflection of strategic competition in Africa. This reflects a stream of seemingly isolated and uncoordinated policy decisions from an administration that promised to be all in on Africa. The Sahel is now in complete state of freefall. We haven't seen a military response alone that will not address counterterrorism, democratic backsliding, and rising anti-Western sentiment. Niger is the latest example in a worrying trend where containment by an absence of alternatives becomes policy. We know that retrenching and isolationist policy will not make the increasingly dire situations in Sudan, Chad, Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso go away. 2024 represents a pivotal year for democracy on the continent. We saw how contentious the elections in Senegal were. Now we're just days away from pivotal election in South Africa. From the beginning of my chairmanship, I've voiced concerns over the inconsistent actions of the ANC and their abandonment of Africa's proud tradition of non-alignment. We are just days away from their critical election. Ghana and Mozambique will also face transitions of power later this year. These are all essential frontline states for the preservation of hard-fought freedoms, yet I know the vast majority of democracy and governance resources go to places like Zimbabwe, Somalia, and Ethiopia, countries which have not nor are currently exhibiting signs of improvement. State Department and U.S. aid should be utilizing their limited resources to support the countries that are aligned with the United States and desire a closer partnership. Finally, I'd like to mention my concerns with this administration's trade agenda toward the continent. This agenda has never been properly staffed and continues to rely on the tired rhetoric of the from aid to trade instead of actively pursuing a robust set of commercial engagements that leads to deals, investment, and outcomes that benefit U.S. and African companies and consumers. Despite the litany of trade and investment promises that were made at the Africa Leaders Summit, we see an exodus of multinational corporations from Nigeria and a stalled trade deal from Kenya. The one bright spot that I see is Angola, where hundreds of millions of dollars of deals were announced to build on the Libido corridor. This may be the only example of new transformative investment on the continent. As the youth of Africa demands better from the world, it is critical the United States orchestrates a foreign policy on the continent that demonstrates why we should be the partner of choice. When you look at the opportunities with the demographics and economic powerhouse that Africa is poised to become, the African rejection of the Biden agenda, this dismissal of realpolitik in exchange for woke ideologies, which many African nations find neo-colonial and alienating, if not offensive. When you look at the expulsion of U.S. forces on the continent while Wagner is being accepted as the security solution of choice, PEPFAR is America's most successful foreign policy tool since the Marshall Plan, effectively not garnering the support of both parties to move forward and putting our political differences aside. resurgent Islamist activity on the continent, al-Shabaab, who has the capability and has voiced the willingness to hit us in the Western Hemisphere, West African instability with Chinese military investment as direct security threats to the Western world, Qatari and Emirati destabilizing forces in Northern and East Africa, particularly in Sudan, dangerous anti-Semitic and anti-Israel posture of Global South nations in General Assembly, which, after their complaint to the ICJ, there's a curious link between all of a sudden the ANC becoming solvent. Now, as we continue our investigations, I am very curious to hear your thoughts on the matter, and I appreciate your time here today. And with that, I recognize my ranking member, the Honorable Congresswoman from California, Sarah Jacobs.
Thank you so much, Chairman James, and thank you, Assistant Secretary Phee and Assistant Administrator Muyangwa, for testifying before the committee today on President Biden's FY25 budget request for Africa. Today's hearing gives us the important opportunity to examine the Biden administration's FY25 budget priorities in Africa and to conduct oversight of U.S. policy in sub-Saharan Africa. The African continent plays a critical role on the world stage. It's the youngest population and is expected to outpace Asia as the fastest growing region in the world, with 6 out of the 10 fastest growing economies. There is so much we can learn from African countries on so many of our shared goals, like prioritizing climate resiliency, leading on global health, and strengthening trade and investment. But like everywhere else, the region is facing challenges too, like addressing democratic backsliding, political instability, poverty, and food insecurity. If we want the African continent to see the United States as a valid, viable, and reliable partner, then we need to engage consistently, not only when it's convenient or advantageous for us to do so. It's why I've been so encouraged by the Biden administration's steps to prioritize Africa in its broader foreign policy, including by hosting the first U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit since 2014. Now is the time to institutionalize these gains and take steps to cement U.S. partnership with African countries for generations to come. That's why I, with Ranking Member Meeks, introduced legislation last week to require regular U.S.-Africa Leaders Summits and authorize a permanent hub at the State Department to ensure robust implementation. I look forward to seeing its passage during HVAC markup tomorrow. President Biden has also taken the historic step of inviting Kenyan President William Ruto to D.C., the first African head of state for an official state visit since 2008. Demonstrating our commitment to the continent also means stepping up and working to resolve the most challenging conflicts, from the war in Sudan to the conflict in eastern DRC. The war in Sudan is the largest internal displacement crisis in the world, where 25 million people need humanitarian aid. Last month, I traveled with Senator Booker to the border in Chad to see the refugee crisis myself. And I can tell you the needs of the Sudanese refugee population are immense. And they have only grown over the past few weeks. The RSF and groups allied with the SAF have intensified fighting around Al-Fashir, the humanitarian hub in Darfur, which risks a large-scale massacre if RSF moves into the city. In response to these developments, I was pleased to see the State Department take additional steps to hold the RSF accountable by sanctioning 2 key commanders earlier today. But more must be done. The UAE, a top buyer of U.S. arms, has fueled this crisis by supplying the RSF with weapons, rebuffing U.S. pressure to cease support. I look forward today to hearing from our witnesses on how the Biden administration is working to support the Sudanese people, pressuring the parties to stop the fighting, and urging the UAE to stop fueling this war. I also look forward to hearing how the recently passed National Security Supplemental, which included $9.5 billion in global humanitarian aid, will provide life-saving assistance to those in Sudan, DRC, Ethiopia, and more. Lastly, I hope we can discuss the many other important issues around the continent, including the continuing trend of coups across the Sahel, Global Fragility Act implementation in coastal West Africa and Mozambique, the importance of the reauthorization of PEPFAR and AGOA, and more. The challenges and opportunities across the African continent are great, which requires a robust budget so the United States can truly support our African partners. I look forward to hearing how Congress can be a partner in this effort. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Jacobs. Other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. We are pleased to have a distinguished panel of witnesses before us here today. The Honorable Molly Phee is the Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of African Affairs at the U.S. Department of State. The Honorable Monde Muyangwa is the Assistant Administrator in the Bureau of Africa at the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID. Thank you for being here today. Your full statements will be made part of the record, and I'll ask each of you to please keep your spoken remarks to 5 minutes in order to allow time for members' questions. I now recognize Assistant Secretary Phee for opening statement.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Chairman James, Ranking Member Jacobs, other members, and Friends of Africa. We're glad to have the opportunity today to discuss the budget request. We are convinced that partnering with Africa is not only mutually beneficial, but also essential to our national security interests. It is sobering to consider the decline in Africa over the past year, especially the outbreak of civil war in Sudan, the intensification of the long-running conflict in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, and the rise of military governments in the Sahel. We must ask why this is happening and where we should invest our finite resources for maximum impact. First, democracy scholars have documented worldwide a recession of democratic governance and a growth of authoritarian power. While acute in Africa, Africa is not alone. Second, we are seeing the impact of decisions made years ago. In Sudan in 2013, Omar al-Bashir established the Rapid Support Forces as a counterweight to the Sudan Armed Forces. Now we witness the two struggle for dominance at the expense of their people and their nation. The complex conflict in eastern DRC can be traced to the aftermath of the 1994 Rwandan genocide. The collapse of governments in the Sahel is linked to the 2011 overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi. In response, the administration named Tom Perriello to the position of Special Envoy for Sudan, enlisted the unique capabilities of DNI Director Avril Haines to promote de-escalation in eastern DRC, and deepen collaboration with Nigeria and coastal West Africa, including by drawing on the resources of the Global Fragility Act. We are employing the new African Democratic and Political Transitions Initiative in West Africa. We strongly recommend, as you suggested, Chairman, increasing U.S. investment in democracy programming to strengthen resilience through institutions such as the judiciary, civil society, and the media. But this is not the only narrative. Across Africa, with American support, we are seeing improvements in health, education, trade, infrastructure, food insecurity, governance, and physical insecurity. Since the Africa Leaders Summit, the Vice President and an unprecedented number of cabinet officials have traveled to the continent. In November, President Biden welcomed Angolan President Lourenço to the White House, and he will host Kenyan President Ruto for a state visit next week. Secretary Blinken made his third trip to Africa in January, and Deputy Secretary Campbell co-hosted the U.S.-Nigeria Binational Commission in Abuja just last month. We are deepening our investment in countries choosing to move forward, to allocate U.S. resources where they will lead to real results. We are promoting African voices in global conversations. We launched the President's Advisory Council on African Diaspora Engagement, who this summer will travel to Nigeria, home of the largest community of Africans in the United States. We are investing in Africa's greatest resource, its people, through education and youth programs. Competitors and allies alike are increasingly active in this space, and we need not to draw back at this critical moment. We are steadily elevating our economic and commercial links. We have fostered $15 billion in deals announced at the American Business Forum. And just last week in Dallas, we hosted a U.S.-Africa Business Summit and announced an additional $2 billion in U.S. government investment from some of our key economic instruments, the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, the Development Finance Corporation, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, celebrating 20 years, and EXIM, providing project support for Malawi, Sierra Leone, and the President's flagship infrastructure investment, the Lobito Corridor. That will benefit, as you know well, Zambia, DRC, and Angola. We provide substantial security assistance to Somalia and to Kenya to combat al-Shabaab, and to Nigeria to confront ISIS and Boko Haram. We remain the single largest donor of humanitarian assistance, and supplemental resources from Congress have been crucial. This budget request maintains investments in landmark American programs such as Feed the Future, Power Africa, and Prosper Africa. We also seek support for new programs such as the Digital Transformation with Africa Initiative and the Vision for Adapted Crops and Soils, and as you've mentioned, Ranking Member AGOA and PEPFAR. We hope to work collaboratively with you on this. Finally, as we collaborate with Africans to confront foreign mercenaries, propaganda, and corruption, we welcome the tools provided by Congress to combat Russian and Chinese interference. The Department and USAID must have adequate resources to remain Africa's partner of choice, and we welcome our collaboration with you to that end.
Thank you, Assistant Secretary Phee. I now recognize Assistant Administrator Muyangwa for her opening statement.
Good afternoon, Chairman James, Ranking Member Jacobs, and esteemed members of the subcommittee. I am grateful for the opportunity to address you today regarding the President's fiscal year 2025 budget request and for your long-standing bipartisan support for USAID. For more than 60 years, the United States has maintained a commitment to Africa. USAID partnerships and investments have saved lives, reduced poverty, advanced peace and security, strengthened democracy, and helped partners in their development journey. Since 1990, USAID has contributed to lifting 700 million people from extreme poverty. The 2025 budget request supports U.S. strategic interests and shared goals with African partners. The request supports commitments outlined during the 2022 U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit, ensuring continued efforts to enhance partnership between the United States and Africa. The President's request emphasizes Africa's need for vital health services, from childhood immunizations to combating HIV/AIDS and fortifying preparedness capabilities. Since 2003, PEPFAR has saved more than 25 million lives, the majority in Africa, and now provides treatment to over 20 million people. The 2025 request continues efforts to eliminate HIV/AIDS as a public health concern by 2030, providing $3.81 billion for PEPFAR. It will also provide $1.89 billion for other programs, including malaria, tuberculosis, and maternal child health. The President's request also prioritizes working with African partners to champion democratic values. In recent years, we have seen increased democratic backsliding globally, including Africa. The $410.5 million democracy request will address democratic gaps and support emerging democracies to foster transparent and accountable political systems that meet citizens' needs. USAID recognizes the need to address food insecurity across Africa. The number of people requiring humanitarian assistance has increased by nearly a third, from 274 million in 2022 to 363 million at the end of 2023. We know that responding to emergencies is not enough, and we continue to help communities build their capacities for resilience and long-term food security. Through Feed the Future, the request of $471.7 million will catalyze agricultural-led growth, increase resilience, and expand access to markets and trade. The President's request also provides for $124.3 million to implement the U.S. Global Water Strategy in Africa, aiming to reach 22 million people with new or improved access to water and sanitation by 2027. With 16 out of the 20 countries most vulnerable to the effects of climate change in Africa, we must also address the wide-ranging impacts of climate change and natural resource degradation. With a request of $342.3 million, the United States will help African countries build the capacity to adapt to climate change and biodiversity conservation while sustainably growing their economies. U.S. investments in Africa enhance economic growth, alleviate poverty, and create jobs. Since Prosper Africa's inception in 2019, the U.S. government has closed 1,852 deals valued at $86 billion in 49 countries. Prosper Africa has benefited 498 American and African companies, stimulating private capital for Africa's growth and promoting exports to the United States. In 2025, we will continue to connect African and American companies and reduce barriers to trade and investment with a $100.5 million request for Prosper Africa. Turning to Power Africa, the request of $100 million will continue to address energy poverty with a goal of adding 30,000 megawatts and 60 million connections by 2030, thereby boosting economies and improving the quality of life for millions of people. Finally, USAID continues to focus on education, requesting $225.4 million to improve learning outcomes for Africa's youth, the fastest growing youth population globally. In 2010, the United States launched the Young African Leaders Initiative, now boasting 640,000 YALI network members and more than 33,000 graduates through the Mandela Washington Fellowship and the YALI Regional Leadership Centers. The $20 million request for YALI will enhance organizational capacity to develop transformative leaders, advancing development, peace and security, and citizen-centered governance across the continent. The President's request underscores our dedication to fostering partnerships between the United States and Africa, supporting development, and sustaining our mutual commitment to shaping Africa's future. Thank you.
Thank you, Assistant Secretary Muyangwa. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. First, Assistant Secretary Phee, what is your mission in Africa?
The mission that I've been given by the Secretary in support of the President's agenda is to treat Africa as a strategic continent. There is a sense that Africa has not been given the prominence it deserves, both now and in the future. And we're doing that by elevating our partnerships and our engagement across a range of sectors.
Very good. Do you have everything that you need in the President's budget for fiscal year 2025 to accomplish your mission?
I think we're aware that the State Department still needs more resources overall, not just in the Africa Bureau.
Great, that's my third question.
Okay.
What are the gaps in the President's fiscal year 2025 budget between what is in the budget and what you need to accomplish your mission?
First of all, I don't set these requests, as you know, but generally speaking, the administration's budget request has not received full funding, and we have not received, in particular, full funding for additional positions. So having both personnel and programmatic resources would better position the State Department, not only the Africa Bureau, but the entire building and all of our embassies to engage more effectively abroad.
Have the needs of the African continent been prioritized by the administration in actions rather than words? It seems to me that if something is of strategic importance, then the funding of these programs, whether programmatic or personnel, would have made it into the budget.
The travel of some 20 cabinet officials in the past year and a half to Africa is an unprecedented pace of engagement, and each cabinet official's visit brings with it programs and other activities and initiatives designed to meet that strategic intent.
If I'm running as fast as I can, a U.S. sprinter who's going to be competing in Paris this summer is still going to kick my tail. Doing your best sometimes isn't good enough, and we need to do better if we expect to make Africa the strategic partner that the mission that you've been given. I have big questions that the administration is actually following through on the resources that you require to be successful. And if the administration fails to follow through on the allocations and the requirements and the budget that they're putting, then America will ultimately be unsuccessful. Looking at the strategy, my ranking member astutely mentioned that in order to be successful, we must be consistent. We must be consistent. And so, therefore, when you look at actions as recently as today, the designation of sanctions on RSF general and a commander to get belligerents back to the table, absent a consistent policy, I do not see how it could be effective, especially if they're not a part of a clear strategy. We've seen failure after failure in negotiation processes, and recently I saw support that neither party in the Sudan conflict is willing to negotiate. Despite this, the department continues to talk about a return to Jeddah platform as it has already failed twice. In the absence of external actors, specifically the UAE, ceasing their financial and material support for the warring parties, which seems more unlikely now than it did a year ago, what can a restarted Jeddah feasibly achieve?
Mr. Chairman, last month in Paris, the Saudis and Special Envoy Tom Perriello did announce the restart of Jeddah. They are working now to identify a date for those talks. It is our belief that working effectively with a key range of external partners that are engaged in the Sudan. Those partners have leverage and influence. That we see that there's a convergence of recognition that the situation is not sustainable. And
I don't think the talks are effective anywhere they're being tried because we are no longer trusted. We're no longer respected. We're seeing talks in the Middle East, de-escalation in Israel, and also de-escalation here. I think that we may be overestimating our control at the table. If peace were achieved in Sudan, what plans are in place to ensure there's immediate support and avoid what happened in the prior transition period?
I would posit that the Sudanese people do trust the United States, seek our continued active involvement. And as you know, the three strands of our effort that Special Envoy Perriello is now leading is first the negotiations to end the hostilities. Second, work with the Sudanese people on a political transition and working with our African partners to support them. And third, the role of humanitarian assistance in addressing the challenges. So absolutely there will be many important steps to follow up on if we achieve the goal of a ceasefire.
Okay, well, I think we have a long way to go to re-earn back the trust of even Congress, not to mention those around the world who see us as all talk at this point. I now recognize Ranking Member Jacobs for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I want to start off by discussing the $9.5 billion in humanitarian aid included in the recently passed National Security Supplemental. This aid will enable much-needed U.S. assistance to Sudan, the DRC, Ethiopia, and more. Assistant Secretary Phee and Assistant Administrator Muyangwa, can you discuss the significance of this assistance and how specifically this assistance will help the continent, including the Sudanese people who are currently in dire need?
Thank you very much for that question. I want to start first and foremost by thanking Congress for its support on the Sudan crisis. The United States is gravely concerned about the deteriorating humanitarian assistance in Sudan. It is now the largest displacement crisis in the world. As Representative Jacobs mentioned early on, we have nearly 9 million people displaced, both inside and outside of Sudan. In addition, we have 25 million people, approximately half of the country's population, that are in need of humanitarian assistance, from 5 million on the brink of starvation. I also want to acknowledge up front that the United States has a long history of support to the people of Sudan. In fact, last year, the United States was the largest provider of humanitarian assistance to Sudan, having provided nearly $1 billion between U.S. aid and the Department of State in assistance in fiscal year 2023. Sudan is one of a handful of priorities on the humanitarian front for U.S. aid and for DOS. And so absolutely the supplemental will go towards supporting the humanitarian assistance in Sudan. What we intend to do with the supplemental is to support more than 30 public and international organizations and NGOs who are providing life-saving assistance. We want to scale up our emergency and life-saving activities, including food assistance, healthcare protection services, shelter support, water, sanitation, and hygiene. We are also looking to provide life-saving nutrition assistance to thousands of acutely malnourished children under the age of 5. We are also looking to providing mainstream protection programming throughout all of USAID's BHA's programming, given the escalating use of sexual and gender-based violence, the targeted attacks on civilians based on ethnicity, as well as the grave violations of children's rights. In addition, we will be looking to scale up our support to grassroots organizations in Sudan, increasing funding to civil society organizations, including local responder networks on the front lines of this war. So that's just some of the stuff that we intend to do with the much-needed supplemental to support the Sudanese people as they navigate this crisis.
Thank you. And Assistant Secretary Phee, I'd like to turn to the issue of UAE in Sudan. We know the UAE is a top buyer of U.S. arms, and yet so far have seemed unaffected by recent pressure from the Biden administration to cease its support to the RSF. Why do you think the UAE continues to provide support to the RSF, and what tools is the United States willing to leverage to further apply pressure?
We want to thank you for highlighting the challenge of external support to both the SAF and the RSF. Such assistance only deepens and prolongs the conflict, and we need to work with all external partners who are engaged in that unhelpful trajectory. We believe that cutting off the support, it will be critical to ending the violence, and that any country that continues to provide material support to either side bears a responsibility for fueling these atrocities against the Sudanese people. The discussions in Jeddah are designed to address some shared concerns that many of us have, particularly the return of Bashir-era regime officials. That has been a concern of the RSF and a concern of the Emiratis. I think if in the discussions we can see if we can address that challenge, we will be able to address some of the interests that are affecting postures of different governments.
Thank you. Well, I think it's long past time that we in Congress make our position clear, and so I'll be planning on introducing legislation on this as well. Thank you so much. I yield back.
I'd be interested in reading and supporting as far as I possibly can. I now recognize Congressman Beard for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Phee, South Africa has time and again shown the Western world that it would rather align itself with Beijing, Moscow, or even Hamas. And most polls suggest that the ANC will fall below 50% of the vote for the first time following the country's elections in May. So a reality that shows both the importance of this election, but also the level of uncertainty that exists in South Africa's immediate future. How is the department planning to engage with Pretoria in the post-election landscape?
Thank you for your question and your focus on this important country on the continent. As you noted, these are questions South Africans themselves are debating. This is the first time in its history that the ANC is dealing with real, genuine challenges to its primacy. And I believe that some of these conversations are based on the points that you raised. We will continue to engage with South Africa, commensurate with its importance, both not only on the continent, but globally. We have important trade ties, important energy ties, important diplomatic ties. We also have issues of concern that you cited, particularly some of South Africa's engagement with Russia and China, and we will continue to raise concerns with any new government if they continue to pursue those policies.
Thank you. Dr. Muyangwa, despite the plethora of U.S. aid funding and programming resources towards democracy-building programs, the number of coups occurring in Africa continent has risen over the last few years. So how is U.S. aid readjusting its strategic approach towards democracy-building programming in response to these clear instances of failure, such as Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso?
Thank you so much for that question. You will note that in the 2025 budget request, we are requesting $410.5 million to support democracy on the African continent. That is an increase of over $137 million in recognition of the challenges that we are facing in Africa as far as democracy is concerned. So with that, what we hope to do is really lean into our programming as USAID, one on one on arresting democratic backsliding where that's possible. Two, on investing in emerging democracy so we can expand and consolidate democracy where we have democratic promise on the continent. Third, we are continuing to maintain a presence, because Afrobarometer, a key survey by an African-led organization, shows that the demand amongst Africans for democracy remains high. Many, close to 64%, I think it is, believe that democracy is the best system of governance. With that, we want to strengthen our ties in terms of supporting civil society on the African continent to realize their democratic aspirations. So those are just some of the things that we hope to do with this increased budget request to support democracy in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you. And right on along that same line, I serve on the Agricultural Committee, so I'm interested in making sure that the commodities that we use in U.S. aid actually get to those that need it. And so if you just make a comment about that, because we're going through the Farm Bill right now, so.
Sure. I'm not, is your question about some of the democratic impediments that we are facing in a number of countries in terms of getting the commodities to the people who need them? I'm trying to.
Absolutely. I just want to make sure, you know, the farmers and ranchers in this country really like to help other people in other countries. But we want to make sure the product is getting to them that need it.
No, absolutely. We continue. That has not changed in terms of our approach. Where we are struggling is with delivery of humanitarian assistance in some of these non-permissive environments, such as Sudan, where we have an ongoing conflict and access to the delivery of humanitarian assistance has been blocked. But our commitment to exploring ways of getting the humanitarian assistance to the people who need it most continues. And USAID has set up a working group and is reaching out to the humanitarian actors themselves to figure out how we can bring in best practices to make sure that we can continue to deliver the humanitarian assistance where it's needed.
Thank you very much, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Baird. I now recognize Congressman Jackson for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chairman James, Ranking Member Jacobs. I'd like to ask about South Africa, and specifically I'll have a follow-up question regarding AGOA. What economic and diplomatic impacts in South Africa or the region for Southern Africa might result if South Africa were to be declared AGOA ineligible?
Thank you, Congressman Jackson. About 600 U.S. companies are present in South Africa. They are part of an ecosystem that AGOA supports in building up ties between African and American companies, which benefit both Americans and Africans. So I think we would see a deterioration in our trade and investment ties that would not be beneficial to American businesses, American employers, American consumers. We've seen over the lifetime of AGOA efforts by American and African companies to invest in building up these trade ties, and that investment would be lost if AGOA was not renewed in South Africa, particularly or generally on the continent.
Question, how would you like to see AGOA strengthen or more incentives put into AGOA so we can keep the trade bloc cohesive?
We would like to see, first of all, AGOA be renewed as soon as possible. As you may know, businesses like predictability, and because there's not predictability, it's affecting their investment and their choices. So that would be the first baseline request we would have. Secondly, we believe it's important to modernize and upgrade the program, which is now dates to 20 years, particularly looking at sectors such as critical minerals. And we believe there are models and ways to do that, and we would like to work with Congress.
Well, thank you so much, and I'd like to make just one statement for the record. As AGOA now approaches its 24th, 25th year since 2000 to 2024, I am a proponent of extending it. I would personally like to see it extended beyond 25 years for a Vision 2050, when the continent will have 25% of the world's population And when AGOA started, it had such great promise of the 55 countries on the continent, and then kind of focusing on 49 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, if you will, Black Africa, and now it's down to 35, 37 countries. Almost a third of the countries that we started with in AGOA 25 years ago have now been disqualified for political violence, cultural, or something. That's not true of the European trade bloc. That's not true of the ASEAN trade blocs. That's not true of most other countries that we've had long-term increased diplomacy with. So I would like to see that increased, and let's respect other people's cultures and have respectful agreements and differences, and not use AGOA as a tool to bludgeon and exclude countries. Thank you. I yield back my time to Congressman James.
Mr. Jackson, I appreciate your sentiments about AGOA, this very important program, and I look forward to working with you on that Vision 2050. 22? What is it, year? 2050, that's right.
2050. Congressman
A lot
James.
of numbers flying around here.
The Honorable Congressman James, I just need to say that on the record. My pleasure, sir.
Yes, sir, absolutely. I now recognize Congressman Moran for 50. I now recognize Congressman Moran for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman James. I thought you were going to give me 50 minutes.
50 minutes, yeah, never give a politician more time to talk.
Thank you so much. I appreciate your letting me be a part of this hearing today. Assistant Secretary Phee and Assistant Administrator Dr. Muyangwa, I'd like to ask you a few questions about illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing off of Africa's coasts. As you know, that's known as IUU fishing. IUU fishing is an increasing threat to the continent's economic self-sufficiency and food security. Reports estimate that Africa incurs an annual revenue loss as high as $11.2 billion a year as a result of IUU fishing off of its coasts. And the real problem with that is when we look at the PRC's involvement. The PRC has the largest distant water fleet, and an estimated 80% of the companies most responsible for IUU fishing are based in China. IUU fishing is the same issue that created the conditions for the emergence of Somali pirates 15 years ago. And I'm concerned that IUU fishing predominantly by PRC vessels continues to erode Africa's fish stocks and is creating economic and food security concerns throughout the continent, even worse than where they're at now. Not to mention China's illegal and aggressive tactics puts our own fishing industry at a competitive disadvantage. First, I'd like to ask both of you, start with you, Dr. Assistant Secretary Phee. Do you agree that the PRC distant water fleet is one of the worst offenders engaging in illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing off of Africa's coasts?
I don't think I'm qualified to endorse the adjective, but certainly PRC illegal fishing is a deep problem for our African partners and friends.
Dr. Muyangwa, would you agree with that?
Yes.
And it's certainly in our national interests, the interests of the United States, to work to stop the PRC's influence in the region. Would you agree with that as well?
You mean in this specific area of maritime security?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
You know, in 2020, the Coast Guard called IUU fishing, quote, the leading global maritime security threat in its illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing strategic outlook. But in 2023, there were 0 U.S. Coast Guard attaches or liaisons deployed in Africa. I don't know if you were aware of that or not. I'm currently working on legislation that aims to increase U.S. cooperation with partner African countries to counter IUU fishing and seeks to increase the technical knowledge of U.S. embassy personnel in key counter IUU countries. Assistant Administrator Muyangwa, I would ask you this. Please tell the committee if you know how your agencies presently are working with our African partners to increase their maritime domain awareness and capacity to counter IUU fishing off their coasts.
I'm not sure that USAID is has a role on that specific issue, but we would be on the IUU fishing is what you're talking about?
That's
Yes.
correct.
But I'll be happy to follow up with our team and get back to you on that one.
Secretary Phee, how about you from the State Department?
Absolutely. It's something we're focused on, and I appreciate you raising this issue and discussing how we might provide more resources to get at it. We have several sets of programs run out of the State Department, out of our INL Bureau, International Narcotics and Law Enforcement, out of our Counterterrorism Bureau. We do partner with the Coast Guard, though, as you noted, their resources are limited. In West Africa, in the Gulf of Guinea, there is a Gulf of Guinea group in which we participate, and we try and promote maritime domain security awareness both on the West Coast and the East Coast. So there are a number of programs underway, but we would welcome more resources and attention to the issue.
Since we're talking about it today and as it relates to the budget, are there things specifically that Congress can do that we're not already doing to give you the tools at the State Department or USAID to be able to push back against the PRC's influence as it relates to IUU fishing?
Congressman, the issues or the proposals that you outlined seemed very positive, and we would look forward to reviewing them.
And I would just add that my colleagues back here just told me that USAID does indeed have a program looking to combat IUU in West Africa, and we do that through our regional programs, so across the entire West Africa. We'll be happy to continue the conversation with you about how we might work together on that agenda.
I certainly appreciate both of those commitments to continue to push back against the PRC's influence as it relates to IUU fishing in Africa, and particularly West Africa, where it's the worst. And we'll be glad to work with your offices, both of you, to engage you to make sure that whatever we push forward with will actually result in something positive for both Africa and to meet the security interests of the United States. Thank you so much. I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize Congresswoman Kamlager Dove for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and it's good to see you both again. Since you came before this committee last year, the foreign policy challenges have deepened and multiplied with Putin advancing against an outgunned Ukraine and the outbreak of the war in Gaza, threatening escalation into a much larger regional conflict. And these crises have certainly consumed our media and politics and high-level foreign policy attention. What continues to be left out of the headlines, of course, is the continent of Africa. The war in Sudan has entered into its second year and is now the world's largest hunger and internal displacement crisis. The forced exit of U.S. forces from Niger has dealt a blow to counterterrorism efforts in the Sahel. The upcoming exit of the UN peacekeeping mission in Somalia raises questions about the country's security as the offensive against al-Shabaab stalls. These challenges deserve much more attention than we are collectively giving them. And most importantly, the opportunities that can come from deeper partnerships with the continent are slipping away if we don't prioritize engagement with Africa as we promised at the Africa Leaders Summit. I also just have to add that, we're probably not running the table because of our Republican colleagues, who see chaos when they look at us from the world stage. It took us multiple months to pass supplemental bills that were there to support our allies. And they also included humanitarian aid for many countries across the continent of Africa. And this delay was really perpetuated by many, not all, of my colleagues from across the aisle. And I would be remiss if I also didn't say that we have a Republican presidential candidate running who's promoting a return to isolationism, which I believe is a failed proposition, especially given our new reality and adversaries. And I hope that we all collectively push back against the notion of isolationism, especially as we are trying to deepen substantial, meaningful relationships with countries throughout the continent of Africa. I think that is what folks are looking to see from us. So I just have a few questions. Assistant Administrator Muyangwa, what is the United States doing to ensure broader international support for the humanitarian crisis in Eastern DRC?
Thank you for that question. The DRC, the humanitarian crisis in the DRC continues to worsen. I was just up in Goma in October 2023, and the situation there is dire. Since that visit, about 450,000 more people have been displaced into in the Eastern DRC. And the conditions have worsened, both in terms of just shelter and access to the goods that people need, and the land on which some of these IDPs are on. We cannot dig wells in, so just access to clean water. The United States government last year was the largest contributor to humanitarian assistance in the DRC, providing $895 million in humanitarian assistance to the DRC. That's almost 2/3 of the humanitarian assistance going into that region. We continue to call on international partners to join us in saving lives in the Eastern DRC. I know my colleague, Assistant Secretary Phee, has also been very active in terms of working on the diplomatic front to address the issues that are giving rise to the displacement of people in the Eastern DRC. And maybe I should turn it over to her just to mention a little bit what we're doing on the diplomatic side to try and address the situation in Eastern Congo.
You have 9 seconds, so say what you can.
Good news, EU, Southern Africa, and others are interested in doing more in Eastern DRC and trying to assist both on the causes of the displacement and providing assistance to address the consequences.
Great, thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, ladies, and I would remind my colleagues that hypocrisy can be as dangerous as rhetoric. Actions speak louder than words. I now recognize my colleague, Congresswoman Kim, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman James. Thank you, witnesses, for joining us today. Ms. Phee, throughout the conflict in Sudan, Chad has been an ally for the UAE and allowing them to funnel weapons to the Rapid Support Forces through the Eastern Chad. In return, we know Chad received $1.5 billion loan from the UAE, which is an amount that is equal to 80% of the Chad's annual state budget. This support has angered many of Chad's Zagawa elites, right? President Deby's recent disputed election victory and RSF's current attack on El Fasher, the North Darfur state capital city, which many Zagawa generals had drawn as a red line, have increased speculation regarding Chad's stability. So what would the implication for political stability in Chad be if an attack on El Fasher happens?
Thank you for raising the complicated political and security situation in Chad. We are seeking to avoid an assault on El Fasher, not only because it's a large capital city of the state, but because so many IDPs have sought refuge there. So that's a focus of our diplomacy right now, and what Special Envoy Tom Perriello is attempting to seek support from partners in Africa and in the Arab world.
So let's say if El Fasher is attacked, what impact would this have on the UAE's ability to funnel weapons and materials through Chad to the RSF?
It's hard for me to speculate, but it appears that the negative attention that would result from the atrocities that we would anticipate that would occur as a result of an attack should be, we would hope, a deterrent to any external party supporting the fighting forces in El Fasher. Okay. I also must note that SAF is using air power against civilians in Darfur as well. So both sides and their allied militias are culpable.
Got it. Ms. Phee, many of our members are extremely concerned about the recent reports of our troop withdrawal from Niger and the abandonment by this administration of the 1,000 troops still in the country who are stuck in the limbo for months. Now we see that Russian troops are stationed on the same base, highly increasing the possibility of a negative encounter. So you participate in those discussions with the Nigerians, right? What happened in those negotiations that led to that fallout?
Thanks for letting me have the opportunity to update you on the facts of the situation. As you noted, I led an interagency mission to Niamey in March, and our task was to determine whether we could identify a mutually acceptable model of security cooperation that respected both sides' interests and priorities. For our part, we shared priorities that included respect for democracy and our respect for our own national security priorities. These priorities, of course, were established by the interagency. As you've heard Secretary Blinken say, in our engagement in Africa, we do not seek to limit the choice of external partners for our African friends. But we believe the United States is a good partner, and in Niger in particular, our track record over many years showed real progress in security and development. We shared with them legitimate concerns about the trajectory of the CNSP in their discussions with Russia and Iran. And in the end, we were not able to reach an understanding that addressed our American priorities. So we are currently working with the CNSP to withdraw U.S. forces. Right now, General Dag Anderson, the J7, and Assistant Secretary Chris Mayer of SOLIC, the Office of Special Operations and Low Intensity Conflict of the Office of the Secretary of Defense,
I want to ask
are
you,
in Niamey,
yes.
or I just wanted to say today, organizing the responsible withdrawal of our troops. Thanks.
Okay, I want to know when the junta approved Russian use of Air Base 101 and millions of U.S. tax dollars were spent to construct Air Base 101. So what is under discussion for the future of the air base? And how will that impact counterterrorism efforts in the region when we're already seeing an uptick in the terrorism because of the unstable government?
So the air base known as 101 is in fact the capital city's airport. So those decisions are in the hands of the CNSP. They made clear that they were not interested, they say, in having any foreign troops present, among them the United States. We found that they were not able to address our national security priorities and values in our discussions. So we've agreed to withdraw from Niamey in a responsible way, and those discussions are underway right now.
My time's up, but I wanted to, get your answer on how that's going to impact our counterterrorism efforts in the region.
We were helpful and effective, we believe, in working with Niger. We will continue to work with partners who want our support and expert assistance to address the challenges in the region.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Kim. I now recognize myself for a few minutes of questions as well. Thank you for your service, both of you. I know you're literally running yourselves ragged, making yourselves sick to do the best that you possibly can in your jobs. But I have grave concerns that the administration does not share your commitment. One example is compared to international competitors and partners of our diplomatic effort throughout Africa is lacking. Between 2010 and 2016, more than 320 foreign embassies opened across the continent. When you contrast this with the United States diplomatic presence throughout Africa, which has been plagued by understaffing and regular placements of first-tour foreign service officers who lack the experience to compete with their veteran international competitors. Assistant Secretary Phee, you mentioned in our first rounds of questions that your gaps that you perceive are not fully funding personnel or programmatic requests. Let me see if I can find one particular to give you specific, but the department did not fully, did request the full authorized amount of $200 million for the Prevention and Stabilization Fund, a principal account that funds the Global Fragility Act. That is one personnel issue competing with our global, I'd say, competitors, Russia and China specifically, by making sure that by not having the personnel filled, and then the programmatic requests $200 million short in the Global Fragility Act. How do you compare these staffing levels to our allies and adversaries throughout Africa? And what's the department doing to reallocate and incentivize staffing levels at embassies throughout the continent?
Mr. Chairman, the great advantage we have as Americans in our approach towards Africa is that it has historically been a source of bipartisan support. And the challenges we face in engagement in foreign affairs are global challenges, as you well know, in terms of congressional support for our engagement, both in the operating budget and the programmatic budget for the State Department overall. We have a principle of universal representation in terms of our engagement abroad. So we are in nearly every country in the world, which is distinct from some of our competitors and allies. So I believe we are strong we are well regarded and well sought out in many, many countries in the world. So we should continue to work together because we all care about this outcome. We all agree that it's strategic, and we will continue to do our best to use the resources that Congress provides us to tackle the objectives we've outlined in this discussion here today.
I do not believe the administration is taking this as seriously as you are, and we're going to go different tacks on that. But I'm going to shift real quick the time that I have remaining. I'm concerned at the protracted and escalating nature of the conflict in eastern DRC. I'm especially concerned at recent reports of increased foreign material entering the fight at the same time as the UN peacekeeping mission, MONUSCO, continues its drawdown. 3 questions. What steps has the department taken to support the ceasefire that Director of National Intelligence Haynes negotiated last November? How is the department working to ensure a return to the Luanda process? And 3, is the department actively working to facilitate a meeting between President Tshisekedi and President Kagame?
First, let me thank you and Ranking Member Jacobs for traveling to the DRC. It's important that it receives focus and attention from visits such as yours. Second, we remain fully engaged in trying to advance the work started by DNI Avril Haines and supported by Secretary Blinken. We have many times met regularly with partners from the DRC and Rwanda to talk about steps that can be taken to de-escalate. These include, on the DRC side, addressing the genocidaires that threaten Rwanda, and on Rwanda's side, ceasing its military engagement in eastern DRC and its support for the M23 group, which is conducting atrocities there. Those are the 2 primary challenges we face. We work very closely with Angola in support of the Luanda process. President Lorenzo himself now is working to bring the 2 leaders together to take action on the roadmap that we and the regional leaders have outlined. So I want to just underscore our commitment to trying to reduce the tragedy in eastern DRC.
That's my time for now. I recognize my ranking member, Sarah Jacobs.
Thank you. Assistant Administrator Muyangwa, I'd like to start with USAID's localization agenda. As you might know, we as a committee recently passed my bipartisan legislation, the Locally Led Development and Humanitarian Response Act, to enable you all to work more with local partners. I know this is a particular focus for you in Africa with the Africa Localization Initiative. Can you first speak to how my bill will enable USAID to work with more local partners on the continent, and then second, share progress made through the Africa Localization Initiative?
Thank you so much for that question, and thank you for your support and for this particular bill. Many of the provisions that you have in the bill would make it easier for us to work with local organizations, including those in the Africa region. I think this includes the provisions that you have listed in there, including working in local languages, which reduce barriers to partnering with USAID. The provisions about campaigns, translation, all of that would make it very easy or easier to work with USAID, as well as some of the provisions that you have in there, streamlining some of the processes that we have while still remaining accountable. So we appreciate the bill itself and the provisions. In terms of progress, Africa leads the agency in terms of working with local organizations. At present, we have 15 countries across Africa who are part of the Africa Localization Initiative. This is up from 10 back in 2023. We have made notable gains in terms of expanding our work with local partners, and we have reached nearly 23% of the 25% target for 2025. The health sector in particular, led by PEPFAR, has been a particularly strong bright spot, accounting for almost 64% of obligations going to local partners. Our missions have all developed their plans, their localization plans, so that is something that we intend to build on. The highest performers so far in terms of direct funding to local partners were South Africa at 80.9%, Botswana at 56.6%, and Zimbabwe at 55.7%. And so we are continuing to draw on those lessons learned to share with other missions and continue to expand our localization efforts, which we believe is a key way of getting to sustainable development on the African continent. So thank you so much for your support.
Thank you. And now I want to go to the Global Fragility Act. I was glad to hear that there is strong bipartisan support for adequately resourcing the GFA. I have two questions. One is, as we're talking about leaving Niger and all of the coups across the Sahel, Assistant Secretary Phee, what lessons do you think the United States should be heeding from the Sahel and the situation in Niger as we're working to prevent and mitigate violent extremism in coastal West Africa?
The developments in the Sahel validate the thinking behind the Global Fragility Act. The governments there are currently, the military governments, are choosing a security path that we have concluded is not the most effective path. And I think we see that the Russian model is attractive to many of these military leaders. But what we look at, what we document where we see Russia engage is we see a rise in civilian casualties, we see a deterioration in security, and we see exploitation of natural resources. So the fundamentals of the Global Fragility Act, which are to support good governance, to support economic development, to support inclusion in societies so that they're less vulnerable to extremist exploitation, remain valid.
Thank you. And just quickly, obviously, we've seen recent developments in Togo where they adopted a change in the constitution that eliminates the citizens' right to vote directly for president and would extend President Gnassingbé's tenure. Could you just talk a little bit about how this impacts GFA implementation and how we're working with civil society actors in Togo to strengthen good governance amidst this?
We have expressed concern about the lack of transparency in the process the Togolese leadership undertook to modify their constitution. We haven't actually seen the text of the constitution ourselves, nor do we understand the Togolese people have been unable to see it, so it's hard to make conclusive judgments. We believe the programming that we have underway in Togo remains useful and valid under GFA, particularly looking again at community programming that targets extremists, to prevention rather of extremist intervention, and also working with local media. So we will continue to try and partner with Togo in a progressive way.
Thank you. But I'd like to piggyback on my ranking member's question on the Global Fragility Act. I touched on this briefly in my last line of questions, but you got a bit of a shotgun blast. I'd like to give you the opportunity to answer it directly. The wave of coups and rampant instability across the Sahel has also resulted in more attacks from violent extremist organizations throughout the region. As a result, the littoral states of coastal West Africa have become the front line of the fight against Islamic extremism, and we understand that coastal West Africa is right on the doorstep of the United States of America and the North America. It's vital that we make sure that we maintain peace for the benefit of both African nations and the United States of America and our allies. Recognizing this, why did the department not request the full authorized amount of that $200 million that I mentioned before for the Prevention and Stabilization Fund, the principal account that funds the Global Fragility Act.
Mr. Chairman, you and I have talked about how we should invest in countries that are moving forward and that can be anchors in Africa. I want to highlight for you that Deputy Secretary Kirk Campbell just traveled to Nigeria, where we had a very successful binational commission. And this week, we are hosting the foreign minister, and I hope many members can meet him, the foreign minister of Nigeria. And we're seeking to deepen and collaborate our cooperation with Nigeria in the sub-region. Nigeria is, of course, Africa's largest democracy and can play an important role in security in the Gulf of Guinea, which we talked about earlier. You mentioned Senegal. We're very proud that we were able to support the Senegalese people in retaining their honorable democratic tradition. We want to continue to engage and work there and do more to show the people of Senegal that democracy delivers, including by increased trade and investment from the United States. So we will continue to work from Senegal through Nigeria to build those partnerships, drawing on the GFA resources, but also other programming available to us.
Thank you. There's unrest going on all over the continent. It's obvious. You've acknowledged it. Whether it's Sudan or Nigeria, DRC, but few things incense me, anger me to my core. Not only the massacres, the levels of deaths that are up to 600,000 estimated in the Tigray War. Not so much that they're even happening, but the fact that they're happening and it hasn't even come to our national consciousness. I understand that in addition to these deaths, there's widespread food diversion scheme involving Ethiopian government officials that resulted in the suspension of food aid to Ethiopia. In 2023, the Ethiopian government agreed to reforms and food aid resumed, but they quickly backslid. In addition to their repeated thumbing their nose, so to speak, at a rules-based order that would place not just governance but human rights above the needs of Ahmed Abe. The massacres and deaths above 2 million over the years in Amara, Oromia, and the Tigray regions, and is recently losing almost 600,000 people in the span of a year. What are we doing in the United States government to hold the perpetrators accountable and to make sure that the United States Americans' tax dollars are not diverted from the people whom they're intended to help?
We have frank and candid conversations with the Prime Minister about how he is managing an insurgency challenge in the Amhara and Oromia regions. I traveled to Ethiopia in February along with Special Envoy Mike Hammer, and we talked to the Prime Minister about the importance of responding to insurgent attacks in a way that does not increase civilian casualties. Ambassador Hammer is in Ethiopia this week. He will continue those conversations. A few weeks ago, during the spring bank meetings, the finance minister was here talking to the IMF about a program of support for Ethiopia's economy, and I made clear to him congressional concern and administration concern about these issues. We are also working with the African Union to support full implementation of the cessation of hostilities agreement that ended the war in Tigray. And we also, as you recall, sir, conducted an atrocity determination that showed that the Ethiopian forces, the Tigrayan forces, the Eritrean forces, and some militant groups were guilty of war crimes during the Tigrayan War. Today in Ethiopia, the Justice Minister announced a new transitional justice policy. The Office of Global Criminal Justice at the State Department has been working to help the minister design that program. We need to review the program in total. It just came out today, and we need to continue to drive forward towards a civilian-focused program that holds perpetrators accountable. Thank you.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman.
Thank you. I join the chairman in his concern that Africa does not get the attention that it should get. I hope that you and other Republicans would talk to the Speaker about and get him to reconsider his decision to decline to invite the President of Kenya to speak to a joint session of Congress. I think that would be a way to demonstrate both to Africa and to America the importance of the continent. And as the chairman points out, 600,000 people died in Tigray, and you go to the campuses where people are screaming and they don't know where Tigray is. We also face 18 million people with acute food insecurity in Sudan. And this, in Darfur, we're seeing a second genocide. We saw one over a decade ago. We're seeing it again. We're seeing the horrific massacres of Sudan's ethnic Masalit, I hope I'm pronouncing that correct, and other Black African non-Arab communities. Now, the United States very rarely supports the change of an international border. I, for example, propose that North Rakhine State could be independent or joined to Bangladesh. That did not happen, and the Rohingya who were displaced continue to be displaced. In contrast, perhaps the only example I can remember where we've supported the change of international border, except for the separation of the Czech Republic and Slovakia, was the creation of South Sudan. We did so because the people of South Sudan faced a genocide. Now the people of Darfur face a second genocide. If the Sudanese government cannot protect the people of Western Sudan, should there be an independent West Sudan, or should there perhaps be a confederation between West Sudan, that is to say Darfur, and the nation of Chad, should that be amenable to the Republic of Chad? Is it time to change the international border? Or to at least discuss it as a reason for Sudan to take its responsibility seriously?
Congressman, thank you, first of all, for your concern for Africans, particularly those suffering from conflict. The situation is so dire in Sudan, it's important that we consider all options. I would just note that the establishment of the state of South Sudan, the country of South Sudan, it's not clear, although it's the strong preference of the people of South Sudan, that that can be considered fully successful, given the ongoing conflict among the South Sudanese. And the displacement and humanitarian crisis there. Another concern is fragmentation and how weak states might allow other actors to exploit. So there, I think, pros and cons. So, but given the dire situation, it's reasonable to ask questions, and I thank you for them.
The very fact that you're willing to consider the consideration of this is, I think, something that Khartoum should take a look at. We saw in the prelude to the Tigrayan War, during it, thousands of people imprisoned elsewhere in Ethiopia simply because of their Tigrayan ethnicity. We saw this for civilians and members of the Tigrayan members of the Ethiopian armed forces. Is the State Department doing anything to learn the status of Ethiopians who were previously detained on their basis of their ethnicity, and what's being done to secure their release?
Congressman, my understanding is that with the cessation of hostilities agreement, nearly all of those imprisoned on the basis of ethnicity were released, but let me get an update on that status for you.
Thank you. Now, Eritrea continues to occupy areas of northern Tigray, seemingly without any opposition from the Ethiopian federal government. What can we do to address Eritrea's continuing violation of Ethiopian sovereignty and oppression of the Tigrayan people?
As I mentioned, Ambassador Hammer is in Ethiopia, part of a recurring set of visits where he works with the African Union, Canada, Europeans, and other partners to pursue implementation of that agreement, which calls for Eritrea to withdraw. So it remains an issue of conversation and an issue of exploration of steps that can be taken to encourage that outcome.
What steps can we take against Eritrea if they simply refuse to withdraw?
We have a poor relationship with the government of Eritrea. As you know, they are heavily sanctioned by the United States. our influence is not what we would hope in terms of achieving the results we would like to see.
I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Sherman. A couple questions on China and Russia. Specifically, we'll start with Russia. Across African nations, we're seeing a trend of Russian security forces, many of which are or were affiliated with the Wagner Group, becoming the preferred security partner. How does the department plan to address this trend in its engagement with African countries?
Mr. Chairman, as I alluded to earlier, we see the Russian model extracting resources and infringing on African sovereignty without a benefit to the people. By contrast, our security assistance is grounded in our values of promoting democracy and civilian protection. Russia is willing to provide weapons and forces without seeming regard for the people of the Sahel. That's the difference between
that's the issue,
Yeah.
is that these Russian mercenaries are being employed to protect the powerful, not to protect the people, and the goals are misaligned. And so understanding those misaligned goals, how is the department going to begin to provide a better solution to people who are employing these mercenaries, who are not protecting the people, don't have a desire to protect the people, but only their own power? How do we do that? It's not about a security of the people. The people are the ones who are going to be suffering, and the people who are staying in power as a result of working with them. How do we break that link?
First and foremost, we need to remain engaged for the sake of the people of the Sahel. So some of the development assistance resources that Assistant Administrator Muyangwa talked about remain important in terms of helping not only with health and education, but institutions that create resilience in terms of dealing with unstable, naturally unstable juntas. So that's why I mentioned before the DG programming that she cited, we have increased funding for in terms of civil society, judiciaries, and the media. So we do not control the choices of these junta leaders. We can choose to invest our resources, as I mentioned earlier, in countries that are natural partners to us, have shared values, are trying to move forward to help them succeed and be a better model for the continent than what we're seeing right now in the Sahel. I would just say, Mr. Chairman, I don't think this is the final word on the outcome of leadership in the Sahel.
That's good to hear. Chair now recognizes Ms. Kamlager-Dove for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the second round of questions. It's deeply appreciated because this is such an important issue and subcommittee. So I have a question for the two of you. How will the strategic trade and investment partnership with Kenya advance U.S. foreign policy goals on the continent? And is the administration considering initiating additional trade and investment agreements with any other African countries? I think, and I'm glad to see that the U.S. and Kenya are currently holding their fifth round, I believe, of negotiations for the partnership, and believe that that will promote sustainable and inclusive economic growth. So would love to, I said a few extra words to give you a little time to write the question down.
Well, I shouldn't speak for her, but Ambassador Tai pioneered this instrument, and I understand that she hopes that if it's successful in Kenya, we could use it in other African countries. And it is important, and we welcome the conclusion, hopefully, in the near future. But I want to note that we're doing a lot more in the private sector, particularly under the leadership of Ambassador Meg Whitman. We have the DFC engaged there in digital and tech cooperation. We're bringing in more private sector engagement. There was recently an AmCham event in Nairobi. We're looking at climate and clean energy industrialization. And we're trying to make sure that the American private sector takes advantage of the opportunities in Kenya, particularly the strong enabling environment, which is a comparative advantage for Kenya.
Did you want to add anything, or you're good? Okay, great. So also concerned to see that Chadian government officials recently demanded the withdrawal of 60 troops, U.S. troops, at the U.S. Special Operations Task Force in Chad as they review our status of forces agreement. So Assistant Secretary Phee, what is your understanding behind Chad's decision to question the presence of U.S. troops in Chad? And how confident are you that discussions around security cooperation will result in U.S. troops resuming presence in Chad in the near future?
Thanks for that question. First, I want to let you know we still have a very small number of troops engaged in Chad. There's a multinational joint task force that deals with the Boko Haram problem, and we're proud to be part of that task force and continue to want to support it. Second, I don't understand the request to be hostile. In fact, in many ways, it was legitimate. The security picture, as we've discussed, has changed dramatically in the Sahel. We were working in Chad in partnership when MINUSMA was present in Mali, when the French and other European partners were also active in the Sahel in fighting terrorism. So it's appropriate, given the changed circumstances, to have a discussion about what makes sense for them and what makes sense for us, and I expect that will happen in the near future.
Great, thank you. And lastly, I think at its core, strengthening our engagement with the continent is also about deepening human connection, and that's where I like to lean into arts and sports and cultural diplomacy. It's a great way to promote mutual understanding. So in our last, minute and some seconds, can you all provide any examples of how arts, film, entertainment, and sports have successfully helped to deepen relationships between Americans and Africans? I mean, the huge diaspora I ask because I, represent Los Angeles. I think it is the epicenter for all things entertainment.
I was going to talk about the surge in links in Nigeria with Nollywood, in particular Afrobeats, working to bring many of the companies from California to Lagos. I expect more of that to happen, and that's really exciting in terms of content, in terms of employment. Deputy Secretary Campbell is really excited about doing sort of a tech dialogue and that also allows our values, right, to be present in terms of those exchanges. But Dr. Muyangwa is appropriately reminding me of the CAN. So this global, or rather continent-wide soccer championship, football, as the Africans would say, which was held successfully in Cote d'Ivoire, and Cote d'Ivoire ultimately ended up winning the CAN. So that we sent members of our Diaspora Engagement Council to participate in that event. And we agree and look forward to resources and your participation and others in those types of events. Thanks.
I think the only thing I would add to what Assistant Secretary Phee said is that Prosper Africa is also very engaged in this space now. And so we expect to see a ramping up of that because it really does play a critical role in strengthening the partnership between Africa and the United States.
And since we have a few seconds, I also want to put in a plug for the Peace Corps, if I may. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I do know that the chair of the overall committee really understands the importance of soft diplomacy with his bill that got signed into law. So thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Speaking of soft diplomacy, I have a question on PRC influence, but I'm going to skip over that one for right now. In August of 2023, the Department of State announced what I think is, in part and parcel, one of the most critical foreign policy tools that has ever been launched, PEPFAR initiative. But within that, the Safe Births, Healthy Babies initiative. This initiative accelerates progress to eliminate mother-to-child transmission in countries with high HIV burdens. Can you give us an update at all on the progress of the Safe Births, Healthy Babies initiative? I think this initiative, as a part of PEPFAR, has the opportunity to save thousands and thousands, if not millions of lives down the line.
I don't have any specific numbers in terms of the number of lives that have been saved since this program was launched.
Well, just the status. And if you don't, if you can update us offline,
Sure.
we'd appreciate that. We want to make sure that we are helping PEPFAR as much as we possibly can
Absolutely.
and ensuring the success of the Safe Birth, Healthy Babies initiative. 2% of every woman who gives birth will pass. That's 1 in 50. That is absolutely atrocious. And the transmission of HIV is absolutely preventable with the right access to maternal care and prenatal care. And so we are dedicated to making sure that we continue to support that. And with that, I think that that is my time. I'd like to formally thank the witnesses for their very valuable testimony, your heartfelt service to your nation, and the members for their questions. The members of the committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we'll ask you to respond to these in writing. Again, any insights that you can give us on the shortcomings in programmatic and personnel funding that would help you to achieve your mission on the continent of Africa that is seeing America fall further and further behind to Russia and China would be great. Pursuant to committee rules, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, and extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length of citations. Without objection, the committee stands adjourned. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.